When we look at Judaic tradition, which is ultimately where all of the Christian roots stem, we see Jewish priests being able to marry virgins in order to remain clean, but now we have Catholic priests who aren't allowed to get married. So, what happened to cause the difference? So, first of all, when Christ walked on the earth, he chose not to marry. He chose not to have children, which is something that he could have decided something completely different, but he chose what he chose. So when a man is ordained as a priest, and this is a similar reason as to why we can't have female priests, he stands in persona Christi, which is as the person of Christ. So he is doing his best by the grace of God to emulate Christ to the best of his ability. And one of the only ways to do that, to be in the fuller union with that, is to be practicing perfect continence, to be practicing perfect chastity. So we see in 1 Corinthians 7 verse 32 how St. Paul talks about focusing on the Lord's affairs, and if we get married, that all of a sudden we're focusing on pleasing our husband or pleasing our wife, and our priorities change, so we can't focus solely on the Lord's affairs because we're also worried about worldly affairs. So understanding the difference between celibacy and continence is celibacy is never getting married. Continence is simply not engaging in sexual relations. So you can be married and yet be completely continent. We look at Mary's marriage, for instance. She had a Josephite marriage where they never actually consecrated, they never had sex. So we see different situations where, I'll talk about here in a little bit, that there are a couple exceptions, especially due to the fact that priests not being married is simply a practice. It is not doctrine. It's a spiritual discipline that's regarded by the church to closer emulate with Christ, so that the priest can do that. So we see people not getting married. We see priests not getting married even back to 175 AD. Athenagoras said, "You would find many among us, both men and women, growing old, unmarried, in hope of living in closer communion with God," which also relates to what St. Paul had said in 1 Corinthians about focusing on the Lord's affairs and not on worldly affairs. Later on, St. Ambrose even said, "Whether you're married or single, remain continent." In the 4th century, we have the Council of Elvira and the Council of Carthage talking about those in service of the divine sacraments observe perfect continence, purity, perfect chastity, all in order to fully identify with Christ. So by the 5th century, it was recognized in the West that priests were not to be married. And by the 11th century, they had regulations. So at this point, bishops, priests, and deacons were not allowed to be married. And now there's the exception that married men can be deacons so long as they were married before their ordination, they have a minimum age, and their wife has written consent for him to be ordained. Additionally, in the Latin Rite, there are exceptions for converts. So if there's a Protestant pastor and he converts Catholic and he's already married, they've let previously married Protestant pastors be ordained as a priest, but they have special regulations for their marriage as well, whether it's complete continence or if it's just not having sex the night before consecrating the host, whatever it may be, they still have regulations on it to put them in that state of perfect continence, of perfect chastity. Ultimately, I mean, just as a reflection point, when people are, like the religious life nuns, we're called to convert people. It's not so much bringing more people into the world. When we see all of the people that are already here that might need a little more God in their life, I mean, myself included, everybody could, but it's about shining light into other people's lives and focusing solely on the Lord's affairs instead of worldly affairs in order to help people reach a fuller union with God as well. So basically just considering that point, maybe it's a little more about focusing on conversion than bringing new people into the world. Which brings me into our culture today, because anybody who looks at a priest and says, "Oh, you don't have sex," like, that's unhealthy. It's healthy to be sexually active. But we have to look at what we're worshiping in our culture, to be completely honest. I mean, what is it? Money? Sex? Power? Being the highest up on the food chain? We have to be worshiping God, not worshiping the things of this world. And it's so hard. I mean, you look at like keeping up with the Joneses and making sure that we have all of the new and best technology. I mean, we need to be focused on the Lord's affairs, not the worldly affairs. And by priests and the religious life and everybody in between who chooses to live a continent life or a celibate life, to never get married and just never engage in sex, it's ultimately an opportunity to focus on the supernatural and everything that God has to offer, opposed to having to worry about what time soccer practice, the baseball game, and track and field is on the same day. So, just points to ponder. I hope that everything in this video was helpful, and I'll look forward to seeing you guys again next Sunday. Have a great night.